Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Monolake, Studio. Alright, it's time once again to talk about Robert Henke. This is now my third time doing a video on this guy, and you can find my previous videos on his VLSI and Archaeopteryx albums linked in the description. I've gone on record multiple times on how this guy's music has been very formative to my tastes and ended up being a big entry point for me in high school to get more into ambient techno and find the right mental zone to enjoy ambient music more easily before that whole genre ended up nearly subsuming my entire life in music taste. And I'll continue to argue there's not a single miss in the Monolake catalog to date. Every single project finds new ways to find subtly intriguing and attention-grabbing minimal techno grooves that can either bang hard or create some really immersive metallic atmosphere, and especially the early period work when Monolake was originally a duo between Henke and Gardelis in the late 90s and early 2000s. Albums like Hong Kong, Interstate, and CinemaScope are all untouchable classics to me and sit among my favorite albums of all time. But even in more recent years, Henke has continued to find new spins on the formulas set down by those albums and ways to keep his sound fresh and exciting in different ways. In fact, his previous album, Archaeopteryx, I'd argue stands among some of the best work ever released under the Monolake name. It was admittedly a very long album, with 19 tracks adding up to over an hour and a half, but there were just so many interesting and colorful ideas going into that project, and strikingly cinematic, melodic, and textural flares that allowed it to not only stand apart from any other Monolake album and fairly easily justify the length, but also stand as one of my favorite albums of 2020 overall. Needless to say, when I saw that he'd be releasing a new album, I pre-ordered it on site, and I was really looking forward to seeing what he might be delivering this time around. And as I've been sitting with it for a while now and really digesting it, I'm actually kind of left conflicted on the results here. I feel like all the previous Monolake albums have each found a way to introduce a new spin on the typical Monolake sound to set themselves apart as their own things in the greater context of his catalog. But I don't feel like Studio was able to really do that in the same way. It kind of feels like a retread of the ideas he explored on VLSI and Archaeopteryx without the sense of more interesting variety that made those albums more engaging for me. And there aren't any ideas here that I haven't already heard Henke do on previous projects. In fact, as a result of that, if I'm being brutally honest, I think Studio might actually be my new least favorite Monolake album to date. But at the same time, to make it abundantly clear, that is not saying much, and he has set the bar very high in the past. As I've said, the Monolake catalog is very consistent. This album still meets all the usual standards I'd expect out of any new project from him. The techno grooves are still really strong and well constructed. The dark melodic flares are still striking. The atmosphere is still plenty immersive. This is still unequivocally a good album, and I still obviously sprung for the CD for the sake of completionism. It's just not a great album as a whole, or the kind of thing that strikes me as among his best work. The album does start out pretty strong with a track like The Elders Disagree, the way it starts out with all these huge thumping kicks that vaguely sound like muted tribal war drums, and then it builds on various menacing melodic textures and clanking noises and brisk techno beatwork. It's very prototypical Monolake, and the mix is very full-sounding and immediately exciting for what it is. It's also a perfect tone setter for the kind of material you can expect out of the entire album. I guess I'm just left wishing the rest of the tracks were able to iterate upon the formula set by a track like this in a more distinct way. The following tracks, Thru, Stalactites, and Signals, feel like they're being built out of the exact same musical ingredients as the opener, and oftentimes when I've put this album on, I don't really have an easy time differentiating them apart from each other. The former of those two is definitely a little bit more on the subtle side in comparison with the opener, and gets more well layered in terms of its percussion mixes, as in a couple of interesting warped metallic bass melodies coming in at 1.2. I think there's enough there for me to still mark that one as a highlight. Although the mix of sounds on Signals is so similar to the previous track that on most listens it ran together like a less memorable part 2 to that track. I guess there's like one plucked melodic texture rapidly playing one note like every 16th note, with an occasionally slightly wavering half step downwards in between some of those. But that's about the only thing about this track which stood out to me as distinct in comparison with the rest of the track listing. And alas, it's not the only track on the album that made me feel that way. To jump around a bit, the album's longest track, Stasis Field, gives me a similar feeling. Like the mix of halftime beats and expansive pad progressions may be pretty epic, and I guess the 3-note descending bass synth riffs in certain parts are decently catchy. It's the kind of track that would hit better purely when taken in a vacuum, but sitting next to all these other tracks that are able to hit on a similarly epic note leaves it not standing out as anything super special to me in context. Especially not when I feel like it's followed by 2 tracks that I think are able to iterate on similar ideas in a slightly more striking way. I was also weirdly left a little underwhelmed by the album's closer, Eclipse. While the dark ambience in the very beginning is really cool, and the cymbal-heavy percussion makes it slightly more organic sounding than many other tracks here, and the slightly more sour melodic progressions feel decently climactic, appropriate for a finisher, it is yet another case of feeling like the ideas being explored here have been done better elsewhere. It just didn't stand out to me as much as I wanted. But hey, that's obviously not to gloss over the other tracks here which were able to better set themselves apart as highlights. Cute Little Aliens is not exactly what I would call cute, and sounds just as dark and menacing as everything else here, but I feel like the textures going into that felt a fair bit more organic. The percussion sounded more like real tom drums, even though I imagine they're just as programmed as everything else here. Some of the electronic textures did more to mimic water splashing and other weird squelching and bleeping alien voices. These synths are being shaped in more interesting ways in comparison to other tracks here. The album's lead single, Global Transport, brings in lots of recordings of what sounds like trains pulling into their platforms and glitched up intercom announcers in other languages, while the ambient pads feel a lot glassier and more spacious, and the bass line's a fair bit rounder and more driving. Even if this is neither the first nor the best train-themed Monolake track, I mean, mass transit, railway, and terminal obviously come to mind, but it's still cool to hear him return to a similar idea 2 tracks like those and find a new, more driving spin on it. Prime Lundy gets even more dramatic and formless in its mix of ambience and lighter halftime beats that go into double time partway through, and Red Alphonso probably has the most striking and well-defined melodies out of any track on the album. There's a real sense of groove and a looseness to that track which the other cuts don't have to the same extent, and it even feels marginally more lighthearted than everything else here. I'm not sure whether that track or Global Transport is my favorite here, but yeah, those are really good. There's even a just under 4-minute ambient interlude called Intermezzo, which builds itself entirely out of rapidly plucking melodic synths and heavy bass pads. Even if I wouldn't call this track a standout, it does in fact feel like an interlude in context, and I wouldn't say the idea behind it is as well executed as an earlier Monolake track like Allure Publicin on his previous album. But, you know, it does add that little bit of much needed variety, and I'm not going to mistake it for any other track on this album. So there we go, that's everything on Studio. I mean, I do feel a little strange to be talking about an album like this with such dense and well-labored sound design, with such strong yet fairly dark melodies, with this well-balanced production, and with that well-established unique sound and style so specific to Monolake, where if this album had come from any other artist, I'd say they were ripping him off. To look at an album like this that does so many things right and still not feel completely satisfied with it. Too much of this just feels like deja vu to me. There's no moments on this thing that are going to go down as among my favorites he's ever come up with. There's not a special spin on his usual style that's able to make this stand out in the greater context of his catalog. It's just Monolake doing his usual Monolake thing. But it's not like there's anything wrong with that either. Perhaps it's a true testament to how consistent he's been over the past 30 years that an album like this is my new least favorite work he's put out under the Monolake name. And hell, I would even understand it if other people found this to be better than his last 2 albums. The sound design is denser and more well-layered than VLSI, and obviously this is much tighter and more approachable to listen than Archaeopteryx, even if I personally find the ideas going into both of those albums more striking and well-varied. I don't know, I may have sounded harsh on this. I wanted to like this a lot more than I ended up liking it, but I did still like it. A Monolake album is a Monolake album, and I'm happy to hear him still at it doing his usual thing, even if I might have personally wished for more out of this. I still got enough out of this to be feeling a 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.